My name is Taya Heisel. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the president and founder and policy director of advocaSC, which is a student organization here at USC that focuses on policy advocacy, education outreach, and direct service in the area of housing policy, and houselessness. So I also, as someone who likes to wear many hats, I am also a student worker at the Center for the Political Future, who are amazing partners for this event. We have the executive director, who is also advocaC's faculty director or faculty advisor here in the audience as well. So this event has been a long time coming, and I'm really excited for us to be here. It's the combination of two of my beloved communities here on campus. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do and who they are. So if you want to start, David.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm David Barboza. I'm the Director of Policy and Research for Abundant Housing LA. We're a nonprofit that does a lot of state and local advocacy around trying to get to solutions to the housing affordability crisis. And so, we really see that as about legalizing more homes, making homes easier to build, better funding affordable housing and protecting tenants, and thinking about how all of that intersects with racial justice and equity. Yeah, it's just a pleasure to be here and part of the conversation.
Hey everybody, my name is Nick Weinmeister. I'm a project specialist at the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, which is actually a research center here at USC over in the Price School. I got my MPP here as well. And yeah, I feel like our missions are pretty similarly aligned with Abundant Housings as well in terms of, but approaching it more from the kind of the research perspective. A lot of what we do is basically convening a collaborative on an ongoing basis of about 130 members across sectors. They're policymakers and electeds, as well as a lot of researchers, as well as folks with lived experience and people who are in the actual service sector as well, like so homeless services. And basically it's kind of facilitating a lot of learning from each other, learning what the emerging research is, trying to make that emerging research even better, have it be informed by all those different groups, and trying to get elected officials to listen to that emerging information. So I help kind of manage that collaborative group, and then I also oversee some of our research projects that we work on. And yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Josh Gonzales. I am Education Director at Abundant Housing LA. David told you a little bit about what we do, but I'm less in the, at least indirectly, I'm less in the policy and advocacy part of AHLA and more of the educating people about housing practices in history and sort of inspiring folks to do things differently. I also just graduated from USC this year with a master's in social work, and opted for the macro stuff, community organizing, advocacy, things like that. And I've also helped, I don't give myself enough credit, but I also helped create the Children's for More Housing organization on campus. That is our first student-led AHLA chapter. So thank you, and hi. And my pronouns are he, him.
Me as well, I use he, him.
So thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. I am a huge fan of AHLA and HPRI, so I'm really excited to have you here. I think we have some different perspectives. We've got policy, we've got research, we've got education and social work. We've got a lot of perspectives that I think are so important to understanding what is on the ballot next week for housing policy, different candidates, what races are happening, what is going to be impacting our unhoused neighbors here in LA. So just to get started, I will say I have some questions that I'm going to be asking you guys, and then we're going to open it up at the end to audience questions. So there's going to be about 10 minutes at the end. So think about what you want to ask everyone. But just to get started, what candidate, this is for all of you, what candidate in any of the local LA races stands out to you in terms of their housing and their housing policy platform, their homelessness platform, all that jazz, and why? Whoever wants to start.
I can go ahead and just point out a few. I tried to do some thinking and brainstorming on this earlier, and I think there's a few that are really going to be pivotal races. In terms of just looking at platforms for folks, I think that Hugo Soto Martinez really stands out in terms of just I think kind of like you mentioned, taking a different approach, if nothing else. kind of, just by virtue of wanting to remove police presence from outreach, like that's a pretty big departure from what we've had. I think it'll, and maybe in a less like a large departure, looking to leverage a lot of the Project Home Key funds and trying to adapt existing housing structures, still a really important thing to have as a kind of pivotal part of a platform. Also, his desire to create a network of 24/7 drop-in centers across LA is really big. Before I started at HPR, I used to work at the Homeless Services Authority in LA. So that was like something that we constantly heard is homelessness is 24/7. So the fact that we only have centers that are open like 9 to 5 on Monday through Friday just doesn't make sense. So I think that's another thing that really sets Hugo apart. And then I would also say that I think that the city attorney race is another really interesting one to watch. I think that we'll probably touch on that later, but just Faisal Gill's, his desire to not prosecute nearly as many people, specifically related to things like encampment sweeps, and not pursuing charges around 4118 that is a very, very different approach than what we have had. And then also just desire to hold police accountable related to those issues as well. I think that those stand out to me.
Definitely. Yeah, those are definitely two races that stand out to me as well. Just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know, Hugo is running in which city council district?
CD13.
CD13. Awesome. And then 4118 is a city ordinance, county ordinance, city ordinance?
City.
That's what I thought. Okay. A city ordinance that basically prevents unhoused folks from sleeping, from camping, from having property that is too big to fit in a certain size container, and a bunch of other things that it can be referred to as like anti-camping laws. But really it's a ordinance that targets unhoused folks and makes it illegal to exist in LA.
Just LA's iteration of it. It exists in
Yeah.
several other cities across the country as well.
I want to piggyback on Hugo Soto Martinez a little bit. He's one of the few candidates that I actually directly spoke with. And sort of, I operate on vibes sometimes too, but because I try not to quote folks because I don't want to mess that up. But definitely a couple of the things I got from him were one, I think he'll operate on a platform of disruption, which I think is really necessary. I think that maybe the reason why we have such a housing and homelessness crisis is because people, again, are not doing things differently. And so operating from a place of disruption is good. The other thing is collaboration. And I think that when you think about the folks that are sort of upholding the practices that are contributing to these crises, they can do that because they're a group of folks that kind of have each other's backs. And so I think that it's really important that while practicing these disruptive activities, that there's a group of folks that are aligned and have a goal for that. And I got the vibe that that's something he was really interested in doing. So I'm really curious to see what his run will look like if he wins.
Yeah, and I'd like to highlight Assemblymember Laura Friedman, who's running for re-election in a district that includes Glendale and some of the surrounding area. So we had a chance to work with Assemblymember Friedman this year on a bill called AB 2097, which reforms parking requirements near major transit stops. So one of the reasons why that's so important to us is, we've seen the research indicating that like when cities require minimum amounts of parking spaces for housing, apartment buildings, or anything else really, it makes that development more expensive, and then those costs get passed down. And it's also kind of an equity issue because there's like a socioeconomic disparity in who owns cars, and so it's like people at the lower end of the income spectrum tend to have fewer cars or to not have cars. And so like if you're going to rent an apartment and the city is saying this apartment needs 2 parking spaces, even though it's right by the expo line or something, then that's going to increase your rent, even though you may not even be able to use that parking. And then like in the context of our climate crisis, that's also definitely not ideal, because that's encouraging more driving than would otherwise occur when you're like mandating parking. So Assemblymember Friedman took on that really tough issue. It was controversial, and she ran a bill last year that didn't quite make it, and she tried again this year, working with a big group of advocates. And so, yeah, we were happy to be part of that, and we've endorsed her for re-election.
So, all of these are incredible candidates and definitely races to watch. I know the city attorney race was mentioned briefly, so I want to circle back to that. There are these smaller races like city attorney, like city controller, that nobody really thinks about or talks about, but I do, and I think a lot of us have in this election. Can y'all talk about just how do these smaller races impact folks who are unhoused? Like, how does that translate? If you're the city controller, you're the city's accountant, how does that have an impact, and why are those races important?
Yeah, like another candidate that we've endorsed is Kenneth Mejia for LA City Controller, and some of the things that really stood out to us in our decision to endorse were the way that he calls attention to, like, and pushes for more transparency in city finances, and then like ties that to a narrative about how we're not investing enough in affordable housing. And that's particularly jarring when you compare like our housing investments to our investments in LAPD, which is always very well funded. The city of LA to a large degree is pursuing an enforcement-based strategy to deal with homelessness, but we know that that's not really effective. I mean, just moving people from one place to another doesn't address the root causes of homelessness, like a lack of affordable housing and support services. And so it's really important to center those issues. And yeah, it's like people really should take a look all the way up and down the ballot, because some of these positions are a little bit more esoteric, but they still matter.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that was like the main point I was gonna hit on for controller for sure, because I believe Kenneth comes from a tenant organizing background as well. So it just in like the consciousness that he brings to the office, should he win, I should say. I think like another like slightly different variation in terms of like thinking about like the functions of controller, like approaching things like auditing. I think that he brings a different lens to that, kind of one that has like that bigger picture that in many ways is like not afraid to point out the fact that we are not investing equally across the board, especially when we're looking at the crisis in which we find ourselves. And then I think like as an example of that would be Kenneth Mejia's like campaign was one of the ones that helped kind of unearth that about half of the money for that it was allocated to LA from the American Rescue Plan went to LAPD, which is not really what you would think that money would be utilized for. So being unafraid to call out things like that, I think, is really important. And then also I did a brief stint in city government as well. And I would say that the controller's attitudes like before now have tended to be looking to kind of like expose waste and kind of make it seem like they're almost white knighting a bit about like, this is, I look at all this waste that I found, it could be used in better ways, or just calling out like recently around things like affordable housing, which undoubtedly the cost of building affordable housing have gone up, but just merely pointing out that it costs more and pretending that that is a large discovery rather than looking at, okay, well, is it doing things? Is like that expensive affordable housing still helping people? It's kind of like devoid of that. So I would say having a different perspective, one that is maybe more holistic, is really important. I'll pause there before I take you on attorney, because I don't want to.
Please. I can't. I don't have a lot to add to
Oh,
this.
okay. So for city attorney, I feel like that one's probably a little more like intuitively connected to the issues of homelessness, because as you rightly pointed out, like LA is pretty much fundamentally approaching this from an enforcement first posture, although there's been a large effort to build housing as well. I think that that's been a through line across political offices. So when you're thinking about the city attorney, they have a lot of sway in terms of pursuing or not pursuing charges, specifically misdemeanors. And those are going to be things that are going to disproportionately impact the communities that are experiencing homelessness, thinking about things like sex work, loitering, trespassing, things like that. So like Faisal Gill, like specifically saying he's not going to pursue charges for 4118 or for 5611, that's the companion piece, which is like your belongings. So the 4118 is like about you being on the sidewalks or whatever it is, and then 5611 is your possessions. So just out and out saying I'm not going to pursue that is like a huge deal, in addition to kind of aligning himself with some of the policies of George Gascon, like not seeking sentence enhancements, not seeking pretrial detention. Those are all really big things that would very tangibly affect people who are living on the street if should they be caught up in the criminal legal system. Having a city attorney that is not going to pursue those additional layers of criminalization is a really big deal.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I don't think in mass we think about the daily lives of folks that are unhoused. And sort of like, it was wild to me to find out that they can rack up like charges for tickets and things like that. And it's like, okay, but like, how are they going to pay that if they don't have a job? Like, how is that going to work at all? And then like, once you rack up enough tickets, like that stuff can affect your credit score, and that stuff can affect, like, bleed into other areas of life. And then it's a system that is continually oppressing folks that are unhoused. And so I think it's really important to have folks that are going to be like, well, no, I see the context for this. Like, I'm not going to pursue those charges. We're not going to do anything that makes it necessary for those folks to, be indebted to the city, when the city isn't really doing anything for them anyway.
And then if you do get it connected to housing resources and you potentially get matched to something that's maybe on the private market, if you have those citations hanging over your head, that can make it incredibly hard to qualify and actually get into that unit, or then continue paying your rent.
Absolutely. I think the cyclical nature of oppression is rampant in LA. To continue on kind of the thread of city attorney and enforcing 4118 and all the other ordinances and whatnot, I know one thing that's been brought up a lot in opposition to not wanting to enforce stuff like that is a bunch of statistics on crime. That's been a huge thing. So to kind of just to unpack that a little bit, I think stats are used a lot when we're talking about folks who are unhoused. And I think there's kind of two angles, two questions I want to ask y'all. One, how do we overcome that and focus more on the day-to-day lives of folks who are unhoused and focus on that instead of the statistics that are thrown around to scare people? Then my other question is, a lot of the statistics are incorrect because it's really hard to count folks who might move around or be forced to move around. It's hard to actually, understand the stats on crime if folks who are unhoused are not reporting when crimes being committed against them. So kind of a two-pronged question. One, how do we overcome this stats fear obsession? And how do you think the underreporting around folks who are unhoused has impacted, especially this election? I know I've been seeing it a lot. Does that make sense? These questions make sense. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is, I think, like, when there's public concern about crime, it's not necessarily because people are going out and like looking up crime statistics and like doing a rigorous analysis of crime trends over time. I mean, I feel like a lot of it is really driven by like anecdotes and news coverage, which can create an impression that's completely different from like what the statistics are showing. And so but that perception then kind of becomes reality because it influences public policy. And I think, yeah, with regard to like the homeless count that LAHSA conducts, it just came out with the 2022 count, showing a 4% increase in homelessness across LA County to over 69,000 people. It's really hard to count people experiencing homelessness. And, part of the reason for that is because they have incentives to stay out of sight. And I think one of the things that you alluded to is that, this population is often like victimized by crime. People experiencing homelessness are often perceived as perpetrators of crime, but we often forget how they're easy, like they tend to be victimized because like they're sometimes in some people's eyes, they're kind of like an easy scapegoat for a lot of problems. And so like sometimes people lash out violently, unfortunately, and that's a reality that I think policymakers should contend with.
Just to throw in a stat about that while we're having a conversation about stats, I read recently, I think it was either this past year or the year before that, folks who are unhoused, they make up 1% of LA population, but they made up 20% of homicide victims. So just to add on to they are victims of crime as well.
I think statistics, while important, can be very cold. And I think that instead, there's a need for a sort of narrative understanding from the perspective of folks that are unhoused. Because I think that changes what you're hearing a lot, sort of like what we've heard, right? Like the overrepresentation in homicide. Like, unless you know that, unless you can understand like that there is violence that's both within, but then like put onto folks that are unhoused, then it starts to change a little bit. Then it's like when you hear that some woman who is kind, maybe, and I know that this actually references a real thing that happened, but as someone who sort of took care of the other folks in the space where they were all sort of unhoused and gathered together, and someone murdered her, and everybody around there was like, why? She was really nice. She cared about us. Like, she took care of us. And so I think that statistics, again, I understand the importance of them, but they really leave out a lot of what's actually happening out there. And I think that it serves to dehumanize the folks that are unhoused, because then it's just like, oh, well, it's just violence. It's just numbers. Like, these people are just in the way. Like, there's all of these sort of, I don't know. I can't think of the word for it, but there's something that just, it makes you feel like they're not important or as deserving as safety and care as the rest of us because they are unhoused. Like, at its core, that's sort of what it's trying to get people to believe sometimes. And maybe that's fear. I don't know if it's intentional, but that's how it can come off.
Definitely.
Yeah, so working in a research center, I think one of the exercises I try and do a lot is to remind myself that the average person is probably not thinking about the same issues that I'm thinking about or thinking about them in the same way. And like, central to that is a lot of people are not considering statistics or numbers, or if they are, definitely not to the degree that we are in our work. Which is totally, I mean, that's fine, that's life. They, like you said, numbers without context really are not that impactful to folks. So I think I would also agree with what you said, that I'm not fully sure like how much people, like the numbers are what's driving people's fear or mistrust. I think it's a lot of folks kind of hear the anecdotal or sensational stories that they kind of want to respond to. I think a great example of that was just what happened with Halloween. Everyone was convinced their kids are going to get fentanyl and candy, and we have zero credible stories that happened anywhere, yet everyone was afraid of it. So it's a similar thing in terms of like, is there a statistical significant likelihood that that's going to happen? Probably not, but people choose to get afraid of it. So I think in that way, in kind of going the other direction of changing perceptions or understandings, utilizing statistical evidence that we have in conjunction with rich qualitative data, whether that's like storytelling, whether it's interviews, those are the kinds of things that really do have a lot of impact, and they are also filled with really important knowledge that helps people understand the relative scale of things, whether that's in terms of overrepresentation or people not paying enough attention. So I would say that it can cut both ways, and I think that we can't ignore some of that. Also, the homeless count is just one specific type of data set that's out there, and it's a very specific one because it's mandated by HUD. So it has to happen all the time, but like for our research center, we help facilitate the use of other types of data sets as well, whether that's like census data, pairing census and administrative data, along with, we have some access to depersonalized HMIS data, which is inherently a lot richer when we're talking about, and so HMIS, sorry, Homeless Management Information System is kind of the database that if you were to go to a provider and they talk to you, you go through an intake process, the kinds of information about who you are, like what brought you into homelessness, your experiences, like all the demographic information about you, like that's what that data is, as well as like your program enrollments and where those, like what locations you've accessed and stuff. So in that way, we can use that information is going to be able to help us get to a lot more realistic understanding of what challenges are bringing people into homelessness and what things might help them come out of homelessness, as well as looking at kind of larger trends within this like kind of, you know, this big group of people experiencing homelessness. Like there's a lot of trends that you can parse out the data when it's rich like that. So there are other pieces of information out there outside of just a visually based count. So I think telling stories with that type of data that again is, I'm a big proponent of it, has to be both quantitative and qualitative. It can't just be a bunch of numbers. That's just not really that helpful to folks.
For sure. Yeah, thank you guys for that answer. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the mayoral election, because that's, I think, on a lot of people's minds. For the mayoral candidates, how do y'all see either of their housing policy platforms and homelessness platforms really playing out, like depending on who's elected? How do you see those playing out and having an impact on folks who are unhoused? Again, for anyone.
But, you know, I can kick things off. So Abundant Housing LA has endorsed Karen Bass for mayor, so full disclosure there. But yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, like with regard to housing policy, I think that, you know, Karen Bass has definitely emphasized trying to find ways to produce affordable housing at a lower cost. So that could include things like streamlining on the city review side, looking at different financing models that might be more conducive to lower cost. Because like affordable developers tend to have to assemble financing from lots of different sources. And like every funding source has its own requirements that have to be reconciled with each other and with the city's requirements. And so it's complex work, and that adds to the, you know, administrative costs of developing housing. And I think she's also recognized that, you know, we do have a housing shortage in Los Angeles that does have to be addressed. At the same time, you know, addressing that shortage through infill development is politically challenging, right? Like you know, there's a lot of pushback, particularly from single family neighborhoods, folks who may be a little afraid of that kind of change, allowing more townhomes and bungalow courts and apartments, the kinds of housing that can actually, like that affordable developers actually build and that can actually be produced at a lower cost because like they economize on land, right? Like I live in a townhouse, you know, and it's like my wife and I would never have been able to afford a detached house like in any central part of LA County, you know. It's just, I mean, I think, and so we're encouraged by a lot of the things that she's saying on overall housing policy, but we know that it's going to be a struggle, right? Like there's always going to be pushback, and so, you know, we're really keen to continue engaging in the process and like educating folks about the benefits of more housing, so that we can try to push through some of that. And, you know, and there's also like, you know, people have legitimate concerns about displacement in some cases. And like, we don't want to dismiss that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we think more home building in single family neighborhoods is so important, because like, that's a place where you can build a lot more housing without displacing a lot of people. Home building in commercial areas is a great prospect, and the state just passed a couple of laws like AB 2011 and SB 6 that are going to facilitate that next year. But it's, you know, getting good people in office is important, but so is like continual engagement. Yeah.
Any other mayoral thoughts?
You pretty much hit it on the head for me.
Yeah, I think that framing that as like continual engagement is important, because so speaking personally, I'm not speaking on representing my organization. Now, I am a little like concerned at kind of the vague nature of the language that's been used to describe like housing and homelessness on both sides. But specifically, like when I hear Karen Bass talking about like cutting through red tape and streamlining things, I would like to hear a little bit more about what like that concretely could look like, because I think there are ways to do it. But as you correctly said, it's going to be a battle. There's no question about that. I also, again, leveraging like Project Home Key funds, any federal funds that we can leverage to create more housing is a really good strategy. I also like her emphasis on approaches around like master leasing buildings. I think is really a good one for LA County in terms of trying to just bring more developers on board. I am a little skeptical of her ability to, she says like bring on board, whether it's like private businesses or lenders. I just don't know what that looks like. I know that she's been in politics for a long time, so she's very diplomatic. I kind of feel like those entities tend to have very different material interests than folks who are looking to provide affordable housing. But that being said, I would still say that I personally see it as a much more positive outcome of an election than were we to see Caruso's plan play out, which I think is, again, I'll go on, as you said, you often like operate on vibes. Operating on vibes, I think we can kind of tell like the general thrust of where a Caruso plan would head. A really heavy emphasis, I think, on shelters, a lot of messaging around like getting people off of the street, making ridiculous claims like you're going to make tens of thousands of units of temporary housing in 300 days. That's just not going to happen. And then also just the fact of how close and kind of in relationship, a positive relationship with law enforcement he's been. I think that we could probably bank on a pretty heavy emphasis on enforcement around that. So yeah, that's where I would see both of those going.
Awesome. I agree with everything all of y'all have said. Yeah, I think we talk about that. We talk about the mayoral race a bit in advocacy, and just basically say everything that you guys said. So thank you for sharing that. It's moving now to ballot measures, especially the ballot measures that are on the ballot in LA next week. So I'm just to give our audience a little bit of background. One of them, we're gonna talk about two, I think, that are the most specific and impactful for folks who are unhoused. First one is Measure ULA. ULA would impose a 4% tax on property sales that are above $5 million, and then it would be a 5.5% tax on those above $10 million. And that funding that is estimated to generate $600 million to $1.1 billion. That funding would go to affordable housing construction, rental subsidies, tenant defense, and many other things. So starting with that one, how do you see that measure, if it passes, impacting the housing crisis?
Yeah, and full disclosure again, Abundant Housing LA has endorsed ULA. So you can take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt if you like. But so yeah, I mean, we're really excited for this. And I think like it's important because like one, we just know like there's not enough funding to build enough affordable housing. Like we're not even close. And it's a problem at multiple levels of government. Like I was just looking at the federal low-income housing tax credit, and the federal government spends or foregoes like about $11 billion a year for that. And that's like the primary program that finances rental housing that's affordable to lower income households. So it's like, that's tiny in comparison to the federal budget or homeowner subsidies. Like I get the mortgage interest deduction, that's an entitlement, right? But we're underfunding LIHTC, we're underfunding Section 8, which is like a program that helps it helps lower income renters pay rent. So anyway, back to ULA. So this is really important. And part of the reason is because like a lot of the local funding sources that we have in the city and county of LA, so like HHH, that's a bond measure that's gonna like kind of be spent out over about 10 years, right? And like Measure H, that funds permanent supportive housing. And then like Measure H, which funds support services for people experiencing homelessness and renters and people who are at risk of homelessness, that's going to sunset in a few years. So it's like, we really need to, and so like we did some analysis on this in partnership with UCLA. You know, we did want to be careful and vet it because, you know, we do have a concern about making sure that we're not disincentivizing new housing construction. But what the analysis found is that really the impact there is minor. And so like our cost benefit analysis kind of came down on like, yeah, let's support this. It's providing badly needed funding. And yeah, we're really, and it's also the property transfer tax is also interesting because it's like, it's a tax that gets paid when the property is sold, when folks have money to pay the tax with. And because of the constraints on like property taxes in California, you know, we have to get creative. And we have seen some cities like Culver City adopt progressive transfer taxes. And so we think that this would be a good thing for LA as well.
Any other ULA thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize that funding is needed and that there is so much that gets like sort of sent back. You know, like if you have a budget, if you're a company and you have a budget and at the end of the budgetary cycle, you're like, we still have $3,000. Like if we don't spend it, they're not going to give it to us next year. Well, that's kind of like what we're letting happen. There's a lot of money that we're not using. And so it gets sent back. And so if we can find other ways to get funding, I think that can be a good thing.
Yeah, I really liked how you started like building kind of the historical context around things, and I'd like to zoom out even a little bit further when we're talking about LA, because like recognizing one of the like Prop Triple H and Measure H were kind of like the new it thing when I started working in homelessness and housing policy. And it was just like, oh my gosh, this is more money than has ever been secured in a bond. Like this has got to be it, right? Like this has got to be the thing that helps us get past this, and then it hasn't panned out that way. When we think about the reality that LA basically has not really built any public housing that's specifically for low income or no income folks in about like 50 years before recent efforts, like we get a sense of the scale of what we're fighting against. Like 50 years with no positive development while LA has continued to massively increase in population every single year. That is it's a recipe for disaster, and it's one that put us very, very far behind. And then also we know, whether it's like through statistics, whether it's through anecdotes or just feelings in living in Los Angeles, we know that there's massive wealth inequality here. While there's so many people who have nothing or very little, there are people who have incredible amounts of money, incredible amounts of property and real estate. So the fact that we are able to harness some of the energy behind those property transfers, I think is a really great way to hopefully help build more affordable housing. I also really like that it has the facet of the Citizens Oversight Committee. I would like to see more of that in some of how we apply or create new funding as well, just because I think that a lot of what goes on in local government sometimes is intended to cut out citizen voices.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I think ULA is going to be a pretty powerful force, and with the funding running out, we need more money. We just need more money. Another ballot measure is Proposition LH. So again, a little bit of context for our audience. There's a cap on units of affordable housing that can be built in each city council district, and that was set in 2008 at 3,500 units. So this proposition would raise that cap to 8,500 units per district. It's not about funding, it's not about taxes, it's nothing like that. It would just raise that cap. So how do y'all think that will impact? Same question, how do you think that will impact the housing crisis? Everything. I mean, obviously, like more housing is better. Like not having a cap, or having a higher one, it's gonna be good. But
another measure that's endorsed by Abundant Housing LA.
Yeah.
So
I'm seeing a theme here.
Yeah. So one of the things that's going on here is like the California Constitution has this thing called Article 34. So Article 34 is a referendum requirement for certain affordable housing developments. It came into the Constitution in 1950, and it was originally directed at traditional public housing. And so like during the campaign in 1950, I could go into a bunch of, I've been writing about this recently, but basically it's like during the campaign, the people who were supporting this were kind of playing on like a lot of Cold War hysteria. It was like right around the time that the Korean War was starting. So they're saying public housing is communist, right? And they were also playing on like racism, honestly, like fear of integrating neighborhoods racially. And so, you know, we have this barrier in the state constitution. There are some exceptions to Article 34, like if you privately owned affordable housing that's like mixed income, so like no more than half of it is affordable to lower income households. But it's like in the city of LA, we've been bumping into these caps, right? And so in some of the council districts. And so all that this would do is say, hey, you know, like voters have approved these funding sources to build affordable housing, and we're not going to just say like there's this artificial cap. We're just going to say, you know, you can keep building that affordable housing, and it still has to go through all the normal, you know, planning processes. We're just kind of raising that cap.
Yeah, I was just going to point out the exact same things in terms of its history as like a discriminatory practice. You know, I think a lot of people are becoming more aware of some patterns like redlining and housing covenants, but this is kind of a strategy that was used maybe not as discussed. And then I think based on what when I was looking around and trying to remember, I think we're either at or about to be at that capped level in about 4 city council districts out of the 15. So again, if we want to try and address this issue in a substantial matter, we have to have an abundance of housing in every region, because that's where people are coming from, is every region. And then, yeah, just recognizing that this is hopefully going to act as kind of a short-term, a short-term improvement, while hopefully in the next general election cycle in 2024, we can, as a state, repeal Article 34 whole.
I will say that LA is overcrowded. There's not enough housing for all the folks that are here. If you check out Abundant Housing LA's Housing 101, one of the things you might learn is that just to accommodate the number of folks that are here now, not talking about your kids, not talking about the people who might move to LA, not talking about any of those folks, all people that are here, we are 1.2 million units short for housing. And a chunk of those people are unhoused and they can't afford sort of like these, I don't know what I was about to use this word I don't want to use, so let me just step back. But they can't afford some of these more expensive units. And so I think that is something that contributes to being able to just house the folks that are here. I know that sometimes there's a big concern, all the homeless folks, you know, or the people that moved here and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, actually, no, the majority of the folks that are unhoused are from LA. It's not like there's people just moving here and being like, yeah, it's fun to be unhoused. Like, no. And so I think that, then, this isn't just one of those measures that it's one of the many things that is needed to be able to create a better quality of life for everybody. And I think that starts with housing.
I love it when we can bust some myths about folks who are unhoused. And we've talked about crime, misconceptions. We've talked about, you know, coming from out of state. I think a lot of people think like, it's warm in LA, everybody comes down here, like people will, you know, get shipped down to LA because you can physically live outside here because it's, you know, the weather's nice. But as you said, that's not the case. It's really not the case. So thank you for busting that myth. We appreciate it. Any other thoughts on either ballot measure before we move on? No? Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna ask one more question before we open it up to audience questions. So looking forward, you know, past the election, how do y'all think the results of this election will or maybe will not impact the work that you do within your organizations?
I think for me personally, in my position as education director, it actually doesn't matter. Because I think one of the things that I have a fabulous education committee that is itching to develop and deliver content to electeds. And so that's something that Abundant Housing LA wants to do. That's something I want to do, is to be able to engage with who's ever in office in any race, in any of the races, excuse me, and just sort of let them know. I think that one of the things I've come to realize is that there's a lot of folks that just don't know that, like, the history of our housing practices, how we're upholding them now, like, just people are just unaware. And so I think that even educating anyone who takes office in any of those races is important, so that way they can maybe understand better what their decisions are doing, the impact of their decisions. And so we'll do that no matter who wins. That's the plan.
Yeah, I would say in a similar fashion that as I've been thinking about these elections, or for that matter, really any elections, I highly doubt like our work is going to change too much, just because of the fact of how many people continue to experience homelessness, whether it's like a new cycle of homelessness or it's their first time experiencing homelessness. We know that there's more people flowing in than are being lifted out of homelessness every day in LA. And even if all of these measures do pass, even if we get all of the right elected officials in office who are committed to trying a lot of solutions, it's going to take a very, very long time to try and undo some of the kind of legacy that has brought us here. So in that way, I don't think that our work is going to change too much. I hope that the energy that we were talking about earlier around disruption and trying new ideas and trying new policy strategies, that is what I hope will be the case, that I and all of the members of our collaborative will get to do research on things that we're currently doing comparative research, looking at other places and how they've implemented things like stronger rental protections, how they've implemented caps on rent and stronger eviction moratoriums, things like that. I look forward to when we can actually research how effective have those been in Los Angeles specifically, not just looking at, oh, this is a good idea, maybe we should potentially try it out. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, and I just say, like, thinking back to my previous experience working as a city planner, in a place where we had a city council that was pretty committed to the status quo. I think it's fair to say, not really willing to entertain a lot of changes that, in my view, were needed, like increasing the supply of housing, promoting infill housing. So it definitely matters, in my opinion. I mean, it's like having better elected officials and good propositions go into effect will make a difference, but that doesn't mean that we can just kick our feet up and say, like, we're done, right? Like, it's citizenship doesn't start and stop on election day. It's really like a continuous process of advocacy, oversight, learning, pushing whoever's in office to do better. Because honestly, like, we've got such a long way to go to get to where we need to be. And like, we could really have, Los Angeles could be such an amazing place, right? Where like people can pursue their dreams, take advantage of all the amazing opportunities that are here and not feel like they're just being crushed by the cost of housing. And like, I think we really need to elevate, like, at the end of the day, this is about real people who are suffering these effects, often like the least privileged people in our society. And like, I don't assume that any elected official can just be left alone. Like, we have to like keep pushing whoever's in office to do better.
I think the main takeaway from what y'all are saying is that, elections are very important, and also there will always be folks like y'all who are going to continue to work, and this isn't going to change that. Even if we get the right people in office, there's still a ton of work to do, but it's not hopeless because there are people working on it. So thank you for doing that work. We're going to open it up for audience questions as well. I'll just call on someone and then I'll probably repeat the question so that our online audience can hear as well. Yeah, James.
Any state ballot measures that you guys want to touch on, address, that you feel are important to focus on?
Yeah, so the question was, are there any state measures that are interesting and that we want to talk about?
I mean, ULA is state, right? ULA, or is that not state?
No, ULA is
Yeah,
city or county. City, county.
See, I don't know.
I always get city and county mixed up. I
Me
don't
too.
know why. Yeah.
So, I mean, we haven't endorsed any state measures in this election cycle, but a couple to keep an eye on might be, so Prop 27 would expand online sports betting, and it would dedicate some of the revenue to address homelessness. So I think voters will weigh kind of like the pros and cons of like expanded gambling versus more money to deal with homelessness. I think also Prop 30 is interesting. I'm always thinking about the intersection of like housing and climate. So like Prop 30 is interesting because it would dedicate new funds towards electric vehicles, which, you know, I think is an important part of the climate solution. But at the same time, my critique of it would be like, okay, but there are other ways to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions as well. Some of like making it easier to not have to drive so much in the first place. And like when you work in that space, I think it makes it easier to build housing as well. So
Yeah, the only one that I was thinking of calling attention to was Prop 27, mainly because the way that it has been advertised, this is something that we've talked about in the office, the way that it has been advertised is I don't really feel like it's a fair portrait of what it's going to end up being. It's a relatively very small amount of the revenue that will be raised from kind of opening the floodgates of online gambling, just like thinking about, because like there's 26 and 27. So thinking about like the difference that comes between in-person gambling versus online gambling is really massive. Like just the accessibility, the ease with which you can access any smart device and use to gamble, that's going to be a lot of money. And it is a relatively small amount that would be allocated to housing and homelessness. There's a concept called the flypaper effect, where if there's such a small amount of an item, even if it's technically earmarked for something, you can't fully track like that amount in as it appears in like a state budget. So I think that it's been a little, I would say it's been a little shameful how that has been characterized and how folks have been kind of used to make it seem like this is going to be so much money specifically for housing and homelessness, when it is not the case, and it is an absolute drop in the bucket relative to how much these already massive online gambling entities are going to be making.
That's what I've been hearing about that proposition as well. So glad you brought that up. Any other audience questions?
Let's talk about rent control and like what cities in particular make
Yeah, so the question is what cities have had success in rent control and controlling rent prices? Thanks, Thompson.
yeah, I mean, one thing that I could highlight is we endorsed Measure H in Pasadena. So that would introduce rent control and just cause eviction protections in the city. So like we took a look at local rent control ordinances to kind of see like where they were regulating. And so Measure H would cap the increase in annual rent increases at 75% of the like increase in CPI. And so we had a really interesting internal discussion about that, because, you know, rent control is, it's not a perfect policy. Like if it's not designed carefully, you know, it can lead to disincentives to build housing or maintain housing properly. But you know, we got to the point with it where we thought that it was pretty nuanced. And also like in California, the most problematic forms of rent control aren't allowed anyway because of the Costa-Hawkins law. So like you can't do vacancy control, which is like where you cap, like you have rent control that persists between, like even when the tenant changes, you're still capping the rent at the same level. That's not allowed in California. And Costa-Hawkins also prohibits rent control from being applied to new construction tied to specific dates. So we thought that that was, and like part of, you know, we care a lot about increasing housing supply, but we also want to look at it like as a package of policies, right? That includes tenant protections and better funding affordable housing. So we think that part of this is politics too, right? Like we're hoping that we can build more bridges with tenant advocates by supporting struggles that they've taken the lead on. And then, you know, hopefully we can all work together towards like comprehensive packages of solutions.
So I think it is 7:30, but if does anyone have a very pressing question that they want to be the finale? No.
If we want to get involved with the Homeless Policy Research Institute, how can we do that?
And also Abundant Housing LA. So the question was, how do you get involved with HPRI? And then I added in and Abundant Housing LA as well. How can we get involved?
Go ahead. Yeah, no, go
Okay. We do have newsletters, but you can go to abundanthousingle.org. You'll find all of our information there. You can reach out to me. I'm Joshua at abundanthousingle.org. Some of the ways that you can get involved are you can donate to us, you can become a member, you can join our Housing Advocates Council, which is where we will actually receive feedback and work with some of the folks that are actually out in the neighborhood and stuff like that. And so we have great folks that are giving us feedback and helping us to determine what our strategic plans will look like. So that's another way to get involved. Join a chapter. If there's a chapter around you, if you're not sure, go ahead and ask us. There is a chapter here on campus. There's Trojans for More Housing. Shivani Patel is the president, so reach out. But yeah, those are some of the ways that you can get involved.
Yeah, and then I think it's probably a little different for us just because we're a different type of entity. But if you are a student who is interested in policy and policy research, or just kind of data work in general, outside of specifically to policy, we are based out of the Price Center for Social Innovation. So if you want to become a research assistant, or you're always welcome to come and talk with our staff. Also check us out on the Price Center for Social Innovation's website. We're one of the specific like arms of that entity. So the HPRI is one of the kind of like subcategories within that. And we're constantly publishing work that either we are producing, that our collaborative members are producing, or we have a research catalog that also we use to kind of capture just everything that folks are referencing that's, you know, emerging research that's related to housing and homelessness. It's a really large set of resources that I think are really useful to folks, whether you're writing academic papers or you just want to read about what the new kind of research that's going on is. And then also we do host quarterly symposia that are open, that like it's kind of like our convening that's like public facing, and at least half of those, so at least 2 a year, are in person here on campus. We're doing a lot better now at getting ahead of the game so that we can get it onto the big USC like online calendar. So just keep an eye out on that for the HPRI symposia. We would love to have you all come out and join our conversations. They're really great. So yeah.
So I'll definitely be there.
Yeah, please do.
I just want to add, if you're a USC student and you join Trojans for More Housing, but also join advocacy.
Yes.
Yes, join advocacy. If you're interested in service and educating the USC community and in policy, we do all three things. So join us. We've talked about public housing a lot today, and that's actually what we're talking about in our general meeting on Monday. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that just happens to be what's on the agenda for us. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panel for coming. This was an excellent conversation. I am a housing policy nerd, and this is like, I could do this for hours. So thank you so much for coming and attending. Thank you to our amazing audience for coming as well, and our online audience, thank you for watching. And of course, thank you to our amazing man behind the camera for making this happen. We appreciate it. So with that, I think we'll call it a night, and vote. If you haven't voted yet, go vote.
And you got all the information now. No
Now you know everything. Now
Yeah.
you know everything about housing.
Congrats.
So, there
Thank
go.
you.
Cool.